The three baby gorillas were calm all morning. They had eaten, they had played, they had even ignored most of the visitors behind the glass. But the second that man walked into the room, everything changed. One cub dropped the piece of fruit she had been holding. Another scrambled hard across the enclosure floor, knocking into the water dish near the wall. The smallest one, the one the staff called Amara, froze for half a second, her dark eyes locked on the doorway. Then she opened her mouth and let out a short, sharp cry, not a distress call, something closer to recognition, and she ran. She covered the distance in under 3 seconds. The man's name was Daniel. He was 34 years old. He had worked at this primate rescue center in Central Africa for 6 years. He was not a scientist. He was not a veterinarian. He was a night care specialist, which meant he worked the shifts nobody else wanted, in the hours when frightened animals were most likely to fall apart. He had walked through that door hundreds of times, but he had not walked through it in several weeks, and the babies had not forgotten. He kneeled down slowly. He did not open his arms wide. He did not call out to them. He simply lowered himself to their level, dropped his chin slightly, and spoke in a voice so quiet that the other caretakers near the observation window could not make out a single word. Whatever he said, it worked. All three cubs reached him within seconds. One grabbed a fistful of his sleeve. One pressed the full weight of her small body against his knee. The third, Amara, the smallest, stretched both arms upward toward his face. A visitor standing at the glass turned to one of the junior staff members and whispered the only question that made sense in that moment. "Is that their mother?" The staff member looked back through the window. She watched Daniel hold perfectly still while three baby gorillas crawled over him like he was the only solid ground in the room. Then she said something that stopped the visitor completely. "No, but to them he's the closest thing they have." The visitor didn't respond, because there was really nothing to say to that. Here is what the records showed. The three cubs had arrived at the center within the same 30-day window, each brought in separately, each from a different situation. The details of how they were found are not pleasant, and this story will not linger on them. What matters is the condition they arrived in: underweight, dehydrated, shut down in the particular way that young primates shut down when they have experienced too much too fast. They would not eat readily. They would not sleep in any predictable pattern. They startled at footsteps. They flinched at fast movement. One of them in her first week would not allow any human contact at all, not feeding, not examination, not the basic handling required to keep her alive. The center's protocol for cubs in that condition was careful and slow. No forcing, no flooding them with stimulation, controlled exposure, steady routine, and for the overnight shifts, the hours between 11 at night and 6 in the morning, when cortisol levels in stressed young animals tend to peak and the risk of a downward spiral is highest, they assigned Daniel. He had done this before, not with gorillas specifically, but with other species that came through in similar states. He understood something that took some caretakers years to learn, and some never did. The goal in those first weeks was not to comfort them in any active sense. The goal was simply to be present without being a threat, to exist in their space at a low enough frequency that they could begin to believe the world was not entirely dangerous. It sounds simple. It is not. The bonding that followed was not planned. It was not encouraged by the staff as a long-term strategy. It happened the way these things happen in young animals that have lost everything. Gradually, quietly, and then all at once. They began tracking his movements. They calmed when they heard his voice in the hallway before he even entered. The smallest one, Amara, started sleeping in a position that faced the door he used. Not because anyone taught her to, because her nervous system had learned in the deep wordless way that infant animals learn, that when that particular person came through that door she was going to be fed and warmed and left alone to rest. She had attached to him the way young primates attach to survival itself. And now he was kneeling in the middle of the enclosure floor, three cubs draped across him, and the staff watching from behind the glass were not entirely sure whether to be moved or worried. Because there was a problem with this picture, a real one, something that everyone in that room understood except for the babies themselves. The plan had been to reduce his visits gradually, to let the cubs transfer their attachment, slowly, carefully toward each other and toward the rotation of caretakers who would realistically be part of their lives going forward. It had been working. Over the past several weeks the staff had seen genuine progress. The three cubs were eating together, sleeping in a loose pile near the center of the enclosure instead of in separate corners, playing, grooming each other in short, tentative sessions that suggested the beginning of real social bonding. And then Daniel walked back in. Now Amara had both arms wrapped around his forearm and her face pressed into the crook of his elbow. Her breathing had slowed. Her body had gone heavy against him the way a frightened animal's body goes heavy when it finally feels safe. And the question hanging over the room, the one nobody said out loud, was whether this visit had just undone weeks of careful work. Daniel tried, very gently, to shift his position. He needed to stand. The enclosure floor was not designed for an adult human to stay crouched indefinitely, and the staff had already signaled to him through the glass that the visit needed to stay short. He placed one hand softly on Amara's back and began to ease himself upward. She tightened her grip. He tried again, slower this time, murmuring something in that same low voice. She made a sound, not a cry, not a vocalization the staff recognized from any standard category, and did something that made every person watching go completely still. She held on. That was the thing. Amara did not cry louder. She did not thrash or bite or display any of the panic behaviors the staff had documented in her early weeks. She simply held on, both small hands locked around Daniel's forearm, her body weight dropped low, her eyes closed, like an animal that had decided, without drama and without negotiation, that it was not moving. The room stayed quiet. Daniel stopped trying to stand. He settled back down and let her keep her grip. One of the senior caretakers near the window exhaled slowly. It was not the regression they feared, but it was not nothing either, because what Amara was showing them, in the only language she had, was that the weeks of careful separation had not erased what came before. They had only covered it, and Daniel walking through that door had pulled the whole thing back to the surface in under 60 seconds. To understand why, you have to go back to the beginning, not the beginning of this visit, the beginning of Amara herself. She arrived on a Tuesday night in the middle of the rainy season. The transport team brought her in just after 9 in the evening, wrapped in a damp cloth that had already gone cold. She weighed just over 2 kilograms. For a gorilla infant her age, that number was deeply alarming. The intake vet described her condition in the log with clinical brevity: severe stress response, probable dehydration, low core temperature, non-responsive to initial contact. But what the log did not capture, because logs rarely do, was the way she looked when they unwrapped the cloth. She was not unconscious, she was awake, her eyes were open and tracking, but there was a flatness behind them that the experienced staff recognized immediately. It was the expression of a young animal that had stopped expecting anything good to happen. They warmed her, they administered fluids, they got her stable through the night, but the real work, the slow, grinding, invisible work of convincing a traumatized infant that the world was survivable, that had barely started. Daniel came on shift at 11. The overnight supervisor handed him a brief and said almost nothing else. There was not much to say. The protocol was the same as it always was. Stay close, stay quiet, don't force anything. He pulled a chair to a position about 2 meters from the small heated enclosure where Amara had been placed, and he sat down. He did not try to touch her. He did not offer food immediately. He simply occupied the same air she was breathing and waited. She watched him for a long time. That was the first sign. Not trust, not comfort, just attention. She watched him the way prey animals watch something they have not yet classified as safe or dangerous. Still, measuring. He didn't move quickly. He didn't speak above a low murmur. After about 40 minutes, he placed a small piece of soft fruit near the edge of the enclosure, and then leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, giving her the visual space to approach it without feeling observed. She didn't touch it that night, but she didn't move away from it either. He came back the next night, and the night after that. On the 4th night, she ate the fruit while he was still in the room. On the 6th night, she moved to the side of the enclosure closest to his chair and sat there for most of his shift, not touching the barrier between them, just sitting on her side while he sat on his, in the particular companionable silence that sometimes develops between a frightened animal and the one human who has repeatedly proven they will not make sudden demands. On the 9th night, she reached through the gap in the enclosure wall and touched his hand. He didn't react. That was important. He didn't make a sound, didn't lean in, didn't do anything that would signal to her nervous system that the touch had been significant. He just let his hand stay where it was, neutral, available. She pulled her fingers back after a few seconds, looked at him, and then curled up in the corner of her enclosure and went to sleep. It was the first time since her arrival that she had slept without waking repeatedly through the night. The day staff found that note in the log the next morning and read it twice. The second cub arrived 12 days after Amara. His name in the intake record was simply Male Infant B, though the caretakers quickly started calling him Kofi. He was older than Amara by what the vet estimated as 2 to 3 months, and physically he was in marginally better condition, but his behavioral presentation was in some ways more difficult. Where Amara had gone flat and still in her fear, Kofi went loud. He screamed when anyone approached. He threw himself against the enclosure walls. He refused food entirely for the first 36 hours, which the staff tolerated as long as they could before intervention became medically necessary. Daniel was not assigned to Kofi initially, but on the third night the caretaker scheduled for overnight duty called in sick, and Daniel covered. He walked into the room where Kofi was being housed, and the cub immediately escalated, screaming, pacing, slamming his small body against the enclosure barrier in a way that was distressing to watch and genuinely dangerous for an animal his size and his condition. Daniel did not leave. He also did not try to calm Kofi directly. He moved to the far corner of the room, the maximum distance available, and he sat on the floor, not in a chair, on the floor, which put his head lower than it would have been otherwise, and which reduced his visual profile in a way that mattered to a frightened young primate even if it could not have explained why. Then he waited. Kofi kept screaming for another 20 minutes. Then he slowed. Then he stopped. He stood at the edge of his enclosure and stared at Daniel from across the room. Daniel was looking at the middle distance, not directly at the cub. That too was deliberate. Direct eye contact between primates carries weight. He let Kofi observe him without the pressure of being observed in return. By 2 in the morning, Kofi had eaten half his food and was asleep. The third cub, the one the staff called Naya, arrived 3 weeks after Kofi, and she was the one who worried them most, not because of her physical condition, which was poor but manageable, because of one specific behavior that appeared in her intake notes and persisted for the first 2 weeks of her stay. She would not be separated from a small towel that had been included in the transport container. It was filthy. It smelled of the transit vehicle and the hands of whoever had handled her before arrival. It was not by any clinical measure a comfort object that should have been encouraged. But every time the staff attempted to remove it for cleaning, Naya reacted with a level of distress that the vet advised against provoking unnecessarily. Daniel read the intake note on his first night with her and made a decision that was not in any official protocol. He asked for a second towel, clean, unused, and he kept it folded in his lap during his entire shift. He didn't offer it to her. He just let it sit there, close to him, absorbing the ambient information of his presence. His scent, his warmth, the particular stillness of the space around him that the cubs had all eventually learned to associate with safety. After 4 nights, he placed the second towel near Naya's sleeping area. She sniffed it for a long time, then she pulled it close. Within a week, both towels were equally important to her. Within 2 weeks, she had largely transferred her attachment to the second one, the clean one, the one that smelled like Daniel's night shifts, and the original was gently retired. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that does not appear in research papers or conservation reports. But it was the kind of small thing that, compounded over weeks and months, is the actual substance of what it means to help a traumatized animal recover. What Daniel had built with all 3 cubs was not a friendship exactly. It was something more fundamental than that. He had become for each of them the organizing principle of safety, the fixed point around which their nervous systems had learned to orient when everything else was uncertain. They didn't follow him because they loved him in any complex emotional sense. They followed him because he was the first reliable signal their bodies had received, after loss and transport and the overwhelming strangeness of the center, that the environment they were in was survivable. In the behavioral literature, researchers sometimes use the word anchor for a figure like this. Not a parent, not a companion, an anchor, something that holds while the storm passes. Daniel had been their anchor through the worst of it. And now the staff faced the question that every good rescue program eventually has to face, and that never gets easier no matter how many times you go through it. What happens when the anchor has to be lifted? Because the cubs were stronger now. They were healthier. They were, for the first time since their arrival, showing genuine interest in each other, in play, in proximity, in the early tentative gestures of guerrilla social life that could only develop if they were given the space to need each other more than they needed him. The attachment to Daniel, which had saved them, was now the thing that needed carefully, gently, and honestly to be loosened. The staff had begun the process weeks ago, reducing his visits, shortening his shifts, letting other caretakers handle more of the daily routine so that the cubs' world expanded beyond the one face they had come to rely on. It had been working. The data said it was working. The behavioral observations said it was working. And then came the morning that put everything to the test. One of the senior caretakers suggested a controlled reunion visit, structured, time-limited, observed, to assess how the cubs responded to Daniel's presence after the separation period. The thinking was sound. You don't truly know how an attachment has evolved until you reintroduce the stimulus and watch what happens. Does the animal collapse back into full dependency? Or does it greet, stabilize, and return to its own functioning? It was a reasonable clinical question. What no one fully anticipated was the answer. The morning Daniel stopped coming in first, the cubs noticed within minutes. Not hours. Minutes. Kofi moved to the enclosure door at the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the way he always did at the start of Daniel's shift. The footsteps passed. Another caretaker entered, someone the cubs knew, someone they tolerated without distress, and Kofi stood at the door for another full minute before turning away. It was a small thing, but the staff watching from the observation window wrote it down anyway. Amara refused half her morning feeding. Not all of it, half. She ate enough that the vet wasn't concerned, but she ate without the relaxed focus she had developed over the previous weeks. She kept pausing, kept orienting toward the door. Narja, the most socially adaptive of the three, ate normally but spent most of the morning pressed against the shared wall between her space and Kofi's, which she did not usually do until the afternoon. What they watched for, carefully, were the deeper regression signs, the flat withdrawal that Amara had shown on arrival, the wall slamming that had marked Kofi's worst days, the towel clinging that had been Narja's signature distress behavior. None of those appeared. What they saw instead was something quieter and more telling. Three cubs recalibrating, searching for something that wasn't there, and slowly, reluctantly beginning to look for it somewhere else. That somewhere else turned out to be each other. It didn't happen dramatically. It rarely does with animals in recovery. It happened in the way that real change usually happens. Gradually, then undeniably. Kofi began sleeping closer to the other two, not beside them at first, just closer. Then one afternoon, without apparent reason, Amara crossed the enclosure and sat down directly next to him. He didn't move away. They sat together for nearly an hour, not playing, not grooming, just existing in the same patch of afternoon light. The caretaker monitoring them noted the time and said nothing until the end of the shift, when she told the senior staff quietly that she thought something had shifted. She was right. Over the following 2 weeks, the three cubs began functioning as a unit in ways the staff had hoped for but not rushed. They shared food without significant conflict. They played in sustained sessions that showed real social negotiation, testing boundaries, reading each other's signals, backing off and re-engaging with the kind of fluid responsiveness that indicated healthy attachment forming between them. Naya began grooming Kofi's shoulder in the mornings. Amara started sleeping in physical contact with both of them. Daniel watched some of this from behind the observation glass. He came in during the day occasionally, as a regular staff member, visible but not entering the cub's space. The senior caretaker noted that he seemed genuinely relieved by what he saw. She also noted in the same log entry that he stayed at the window longer than he needed to. Nobody said anything about that. Then came the day of the controlled reunion visit. The decision had not been made lightly. The staff debated it across 2 team meetings. The risk was real. Reintroducing Daniel too directly, too soon, could re-anchor the cubs to him before their bonds with each other were strong enough to hold. But the behavioral data over the previous 2 weeks had been consistently encouraging. The cubs were stable. They were connected to each other. They were ready, the senior vet believed, to demonstrate that. Daniel was briefed on the protocol. Short visit, calm entry, no initiation of physical contact. Observe the response and exit cleanly if any regression indicators appeared. He nodded and said he understood. He walked through the door, and the cubs came apart completely. Not in fear, in recognition. All 3 of them moved toward him at once, rushing, vocalizing, reaching, and the room filled with the particular noise that young gorillas make when something they stopped expecting suddenly, impossibly, returns. Then the smallest cub climbed into his lap, looked up at his face for a long moment and placed one tiny hand against his chin. The room went completely silent. Daniel did not move. He sat with Amara's hand against his chin, and he breathed slowly and he let the moment be exactly what it was, not more. The other 2 cubs were pressed against his sides, Kofi with his face buried against Daniel's shoulder, Nia with both hands gripping the fabric of his jacket, and for about 30 seconds the entire room held the kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty. It feels full of something that doesn't have a clean clinical name and doesn't need one. Then Amara took her hand away. She looked at him for another moment, the particular steady gaze of a young gorilla who is processing something, and then she turned. She dropped off his lap and moved back toward the center of the enclosure, toward Kofi and Nia. She made a short, soft vocalization, the kind the staff had started calling a contact call, the sound the cubs used to locate each other when visual distance opened up between them. Kofi lifted his head from Daniel's shoulder. Nia loosened her grip, and slowly, unhurried, both of them followed Amara back toward the middle of the room. The senior caretaker, watching from the window, uncrossed her arms. That movement, Amara turning away, the others following, was the thing they had spent months working toward without being certain it would come. Not rejection, not forgetting, something more sophisticated than either. The cubs had seen Daniel, had flooded toward him with everything they remembered, and then without distress, without confusion, had returned to each other. The anchor had held, and they had chosen on their own terms to swim. Daniel stayed kneeled on the floor for a moment longer. The cubs were already engaging with each other across the enclosure, the reunion energy converting naturally into play the way it does in healthy young animals. Kofi chased Nia in a short, tight circle. Amara watched them, then joined. Daniel watched too. Then he stood up quietly, nodded once toward the observation window, and walked out. He sat in the hallway outside for a while. Nobody rushed him. What those 3 cubs had experienced in their short lives was not unusual in the world of primate rescue. It happens in facilities across Central and Western Africa, in sanctuaries and rehabilitation centers where the work is unglamorous and underfunded and absolutely necessary. Young gorillas lose their family groups. They arrive in states of physical and psychological collapse. They are kept alive by the sustained, careful attention of people who show up night after night and ask nothing in return except that the animal in front of them gets a little stronger than it was yesterday. The bonds that form in those conditions are real. They are not fantasy. They are not projection. They are the biological result of an infant nervous system doing exactly what infant nervous systems are designed to do, finding the nearest available source of consistent safety and holding on. Daniel had been that source, not because he was extraordinary, though the staff would have disagreed with that assessment, because he was present, reliably, quietly, unglamorously present during the hours when presence was the only thing that mattered. The cubs didn't know his name. They didn't understand the structure of what he had given them, but their bodies knew the shape of him, his voice, his stillness, the particular rhythm of his presence, the way young animals know the things that kept them alive before they had language to describe it. In the months that followed, the 3 cubs continued to develop. Their social bonds deepened. Their behavior became more confident, more exploratory, more genuinely gorilla-like in ways that the staff marked carefully in their records because those markers mattered for the longer rehabilitation process ahead. Daniel's visits remained occasional and structured. Each time he entered, there was recognition, there was warmth, there was the rushing and the reaching and the brief press of small bodies against his. And each time, after a few minutes, the cubs went back to each other. That was the measure of it, not the reunion, the return. On the last documented supervised visit before the cubs were transitioned to a larger social group, something happened that one of the junior caretakers described in her notes as the moment she understood what the whole long process had actually been for. All 3 cubs greeted Daniel in their usual way. Amara first, then Kofi, then Nia circling back after initially hanging behind. They climbed on him briefly. They made their contact calls. And then within a few minutes, they drifted back across the enclosure and arranged themselves in the loose pile they had been sleeping in for weeks. Pressed together, calm, entirely absorbed in each other. Daniel stood near the door and watched them for a moment. Then he smiled. It was not a performance. Nobody was filming it. It was just a man looking at 3 small animals who no longer needed him the way they once had, and understanding that this was the best possible outcome, and feeling the full weight of that truth all at once. He had not been their mother. He had never been that. He had been something harder to name and arguably more important in those specific desperate early weeks. The proof, delivered night after night in the most ordinary possible way, that the world still contained something safe, that not everything that approached them in the dark came to cause harm. That warmth was still available, that survival was still worth attempting. They had learned that from him, and then they had learned to find it in each other, which was from the beginning the only goal that mattered. They didn't go crazy because they found their mother. They reacted because they remembered the man who became safe when nothing else in their world was.